Number 1. Sheila, Eddie, and Rachel Schaeffer, a friendship born in the shadows of suburban Pennsylvania that would eventually descend into a nightmare of blood and betrayal, revealing the terrifying depths to which toxic loyalties can drive young women. To understand the gravity of the crimes committed by Sheila, Eddie, and Rachel Schaeffer, one must first look back at the environment that forged their bond, a setting not unlike the quiet towns often plagued by the darkest secrets. It was the early 1990s in Reading, Pennsylvania, a city that, like many in the American Rust Belt, struggled with the duality of its peaceful appearance and the undercurrents of economic and social despair. Sheila, Eddie, and Rachel Schaeffer were not the typical image of cold-blooded killers. They were young women navigating complexities of early adulthood, yet beneath the surface lay a deep-seated resentment and a fascination with violence that would soon spiral out of control. Their relationship was intense, characterized by a dependence that blurred the lines between friendship and obsession, a dynamic that psychologists would later point to as a key factor in the escalation of their behavior. They fed off each other's darkest thoughts, validating feelings of aggression and vindictiveness until the line between fantasy and reality virtually ceased to exist. This codependency created an echo chamber where bad intentions were amplified rather than checked, setting the stage for a tragedy that would rip through the heart of their community. The focal point of their rage was a man named Barry Kirk, a figure who, in their narrative, had become the embodiment of their grievances. To an outsider, the conflict might have seemed trivial or a typical dispute, but inside the twisted logic of Sheila and Rachel, it morphed into something requiring a lethal solution. They began to plot, not in the abstract way that angry people sometimes vent about wanting someone out of the way, but with a frightening specificity and intent. They discussed methods, they surveilled their target, and they acquired the tools necessary for the deed. It was a conspiracy born not out of necessity, but out of a toxic mix of perceived victimhood and a desire for control. The planning phase was a chilling window into their minds, showing a capacity for cold calculation that belied their ages. They weren't acting in the heat of the moment. This was a premeditated design to end a human life, deliberated over time with a disturbing lack of empathy for the potential victim. On that fateful day in 1993, the transition from plotting to execution occurred with a swiftness that left the community stunned. Barry Kirk was lured into a situation where he was vulnerable, his trust misplaced, or his guard lowered by the familiarity of his attackers. When the violence erupted, it was brutal and excessive. The details that emerged during the investigation painted a picture of a frenzy of anger, a release of the pent-up hostility that Sheila and Rachel had been nurturing for so long. They didn't just want Kirk dead. They wanted to inflict pain, to dominate him completely in his final moments. The brutality of the attack suggested a level of personal hatred that goes beyond simple disagreements, touching on something primal and savage. After the act was done, the immediate aftermath was a mix of panic and a surreal attempt to maintain normalcy. They tried to cover their tracks, relying on the belief that their bond would protect them from suspicion, underestimating the tenacity of law enforcement and the unmistakable evidence they had left behind. The investigation into Barry Kirk's murder was a race against time, led by detectives who were quickly piecing together the events leading up to his death. It didn't take long for the spotlight to fall on Sheila, Eddie, and Rachel Schaeffer. Their behavior, inconsistent and nervous, raised red flags almost immediately. Witnesses came forward, placing them near the scene or recalling threats they had made against the victim in the past. The digital and physical footprint they left was undeniable. In their arrogance, they had perhaps underestimated how modern police work could connect the dots. The interrogation room became the stage where their facade finally crumbled. Separated and confronted with the mounting evidence, the psychological pressure began to weigh on them. The us-against-the-world mentality that had fueled their crime began to fracture when faced with the reality of individual consequences. It was here that the true nature of their relationship was laid bare for the investigators to see, a dynamic of manipulation and shared guilt that ultimately could not withstand the scrutiny of the law. As the legal proceedings unfolded, the public watched with a mixture of horror and fascination. The trial of Sheila, Eddie, and Rachel Schaeffer revealed the disturbing minutiae of their conspiracy. Prosecutors painted a portrait of two women who were willing participants in a heinous act, driven by spite and a lack of moral compass. The defense, on the other hand, tried to mitigate their culpability by pointing to the influence one had over the other, suggesting a follower-leader dynamic that might spare one of them the harshest penalty. However, the evidence of their shared planning and enthusiasm for the murder made it difficult to absolve either of them fully. The courtroom testimony was a litany of sadness, as friends and family of Barry Kirk spoke of the loss they endured, contrasting sharply with the cold demeanor of the accused. The gravity of the situation was palpable. 2 young lives were effectively over, destroyed not by a system determined to punish them, but by their own hands and their own choices. In the end, justice was served, though it could never truly restore what was lost. Sheila, Eddie, and Rachel Schaeffer were convicted for their roles in the murder, receiving prison sentences that reflected the severity of their crimes. Sheila Eddy received a sentence of 10 to 20 years, while Rachel Schaeffer was sentenced to 7 to 14 years, a difference that perhaps acknowledged the nuances of their individual culpability, but still affirmed their guilt. The case served as a stark reminder of the dangerous potential of toxic relationships, showing how easily influence can mutate into violence when left unchecked by morality or empathy. The community of Reading, Pennsylvania, was left to heal, the memory of the brutality lingering long after the headlines faded. The story of Sheila Eddy and Rachel Schaeffer remains a cautionary tale about the darkness that can lurk behind ordinary faces and the tragic consequences when friendship becomes a weapon in the hands of the disturbed. Number 2, Retta Mays, a case that shattered the illusion of safety within a hospital sanctuary, proving that the most terrifying threats can wear the uniform of a caregiver. The story of Retta Mays is one that sends a chill down the spine of anyone who has ever had to check themselves or a loved one into a hospital, expecting a place of healing and recovery. It was May 2019 in Charleston, West Virginia, at the Charleston Area Medical Center, CMC Memorial Hospital, a place meant to be a refuge for the sick. Retta Mays worked there as a nursing assistant, a position that required patience, compassion, and a fundamental respect for human life. On the surface, she appeared to be just another employee in the sprawling healthcare system, blending into the background of the busy wards. However, beneath that scrub's uniform lay a disturbed mind capable of predatory violence that defies understanding. This was not a crime of passion or a sudden burst of rage. It was a calculated series of attacks on vulnerable men who were incapacitated and defenseless. The revelation that a trusted medical professional could turn into a serial killer within the walls of a hospital brought a unique kind of horror to the community of Charleston, forcing them to confront the reality that evil often hides in plain sight, protected by the trust placed in authority figures. The timeline of the terror began to take shape when patients in the same unit started experiencing sudden, unexplained respiratory distress. These were not just minor complications. Healthy men who were recovering from routine procedures or manageable conditions suddenly found themselves on the brink of death. The culprit was a method that is insidious because it is invisible and difficult to detect without specific suspicion. Insulin. Retta Mays was injecting her victims with massive doses of insulin, a drug that is essential for diabetics but acts as a deadly poison when administered to those with normal blood sugar levels. The physiological effect is catastrophic. Blood sugar levels plummet, sending the body into hypoglycemic shock, which can lead to permanent brain damage or death if not immediately recognized and treated. Because these patients were already in a hospital setting, the initial symptoms could be easily mistaken for their underlying conditions, a fact that Mays likely relied upon to continue her deadly spree. It is a terrifying thought to imagine lying in a hospital bed, trusting the people who come to check your vitals, only to have that trust weaponized in such a lethal manner. The victims in this case were specifically targeted, a pattern that added another layer of disturbing premeditation to the crimes. The investigation would eventually reveal that Mays focused her attention on men, specifically those who were alone or less likely to have constant visitors watching over them. One of the most tragic aspects of this case was the vulnerability of her prey. These were men who were sedated, confused, or simply too weak to defend themselves against an intruder in their room. The medical violation of their bodies was profound. The hospital, which is supposed to be a controlled environment where every intervention is documented and necessary, became a hunting ground. The breach of the Hippocratic Oath, the ethical obligation to do no harm, was absolute. Mays used her access to medication and her knowledge of the hospital routines to bypass safeguards. She would enter rooms under the guise of providing care, and in the silence of those sterile wards, She administered a chemical agent that was slowly killing them, turning equipment meant to sustain life into the very thing that signaled their impending doom. The turning point in the investigation came when the medical staff and hospital administrators noticed a cluster of similar, life-threatening hypoglycemic events that had no logical medical explanation. The pattern was too coincidental to be ignored. Doctors were baffled as patients with no history of diabetes were crashing with blood sugar levels so low they were incompatible with life. The hospital launched an internal review, but it was the intervention of the federal authorities that truly cracked the case open. The Department of Health and Human Services and the FBI were called in, treating the hospital as a crime scene. They reviewed thousands of hours of surveillance footage, a tedious task that eventually paid off. The cameras did not lie. They captured Retta Mays entering the rooms of the victims during times when she had no legitimate reason to be there, and more damningly, they captured her engaging behavior consistent with tampering with lines or medication. The visual evidence was a smoking gun that transformed a mysterious medical anomaly into a clear case of serial murder. It is a testament to modern forensic investigation that digital eyes could uncover what human eyes miss in the chaos of a hospital shift. When Retta Mays was finally confronted by investigators, the weight of the evidence against her was insurmountable. The footage, combined with the medical records proving the insulin injections, left her with little room for denial. In December 2019, she pleaded guilty to federal charges. The plea agreement spared the community and the victims' families from a lengthy and traumatic trial, but also forced the world to hear the full extent of her crimes. She admitted to intentionally administering insulin to 3 victims with the intent to kill, resulting in the death of one of them, and assaulting another with intent to commit murder. The specifics of the plea were chilling in their coldness. She acknowledged that she knew the insulin could cause serious injury or death, and that she did it anyway. The question that haunted everyone involved, from the judges to the families, was simply why? What drives a nursing assistant to kill the very people she is paid to care for? While the courts can determine guilt, they rarely provide a satisfying answer to the mysteries of the human psyche, and in this case, the motive remained largely ambiguous, a void filled only by the horror of her actions. The sentencing hearing brought a sense of closure, though not peace, to the victims and their families. Retta Mays was sentenced to 40 years in federal prison, a term that reflects the severity of her crimes and the betrayal of public trust. The judge overseeing the case remarked on the heinous nature of violating the sanctity of a hospital, emphasizing that her actions required a significant sentence to deter others and to provide justice for the victims. For the families of those who died, like the family of the man identified only as R.W. in court documents, the sentence was a necessary validation of their loss. They had to grapple with the agonizing knowledge that their loved one did not die of an illness, but was murdered. For the surviving victims, the trauma was equally profound. They survived, but their trust in the medical system was shattered. The case forced hospitals across the country to reevaluate their security protocols, their medication management systems, and their oversight of nursing staff, implementing stricter checks to ensure that a monster like Retta Mays could never again exploit the vulnerabilities of the sick. Today, the name Retta Mays is synonymous with one of the most breaches of trust in medical history. Her case serves as a grim reminder that evil can exist anywhere, even in the places dedicated to preserving life. The Charleston Area Medical Center had to overhaul its practices and deal with the reputational damage of having employed a serial killer, but the lasting impact is on the community's psyche. Patients now look at their nurses with shadow of suspicion, a sad legacy of Mays' cruelty. Her story is not just about a woman who killed. It is about the systemic failures that allowed her to do so for as long as she did, and the heroism of the investigators who pieced together the digital puzzle to stop her. As she serves her decades-long sentence behind bars, the victims continue their own sentences, living with the physical and emotional scars of her actions, reminding us all that the duty to protect the vulnerable is a constant vigil, not a guarantee. Number 3. William Dean Wickline, a master manipulator whose intellect and charm masked a cold-blooded predator capable of orchestrating a brutal murder while sitting in a prison cell, using the people closest to him as pawns in a deadly game of chess. The saga of William Dean Wickline is a terrifying examination of the psychopathic mind, a case that challenges our understanding of evil and its ability to permeate even the most secure barriers. To understand the gravity of Wickline's crimes, one must first understand a man himself. Born in 1951, Wickline was not a typical street thug. He was an intelligent, articulate man who possessed a terrifying talent for manipulation. Long before the murder that would make him infamous in West Virginia history, Wickline had already established himself as a dangerous figure. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, he operated as a respected and seemingly successful hairstylist in Columbus, Ohio. To his clients, he was charismatic and attentive, a man who could hold a conversation on any topic. But behind the facade of the successful businessman lay a dark underbelly of criminal activity. Wickline was heavily involved in the distribution of drugs, specifically cocaine, a trade that fueled his lifestyle and eventually led to his downfall. This duality, the charming hairdresser and the ruthless drug dealer, was a foundation of his persona. He lived a double life, expertly curating his public image while engaging in activities that carried the constant risk of violence. It was this propensity for violence and his desperate need to maintain control that would eventually culminate in a crime so heinous it would shock the conscience of the community. Wickline's first major brush with the law came in 1982, when he was convicted of drug trafficking in Ohio. He was sentenced to a significant term in prison, a place where one might expect a criminal's influence to wane. However, for a man like Wickline, prison was not a place of rehabilitation, but a new operational base. It was inside the confines of the Ohio State Penitentiary that Wickline met John Foster, a younger man who would become the instrument of Wickline's murderous will. This relationship is pivotal to understanding the case. It highlights Wickline's terrifying ability to manipulate those around him, even from behind bars. Foster was a troubled individual, impressionable and eager for guidance, making him the perfect target for a predator like Wickline. Over time, Wickline groomed Foster, establishing a psychological dominance over him. He became a mentor figure to Foster, distorting the younger man's reality and bending his loyalty to his own ends. Wickline convinced Foster that the world had wronged him and that drastic measures were necessary to settle scores. This psychological grooming is a hallmark of psychopathic behavior, the ability to turn others into extensions of one's own violent desires without getting one's own hands dirty. Wickline's intelligence allowed him to navigate the prison hierarchy and maintain contacts on the outside, setting the stage for a murder that would be directed entirely from within his cell. The target of Wickline's wrath was his common-law wife, Peggy Sue Wickline. The relationship between William and Peggy Sue had deteriorated long before his incarceration, marked by allegations of abuse and control. Like many domestic abusers, Wickline viewed Peggy Sue not as a person but as property, someone who existed to serve his needs. When he went to prison, he lost that control, and the possibility that she might move on or expose his secrets became an obsession for him. The motive was a toxic mix of jealousy, greed, and the desire to silence a witness. Peggy Sue held information about Wickline's criminal activities that could have extended his sentence or ruined his prospects for appeal. Furthermore, there were financial considerations. Wickline wanted to ensure he maintained access to assets she controlled. In his mind, Peggy Sue had become a liability that needed to be eliminated. The chilling aspect of this crime is that William Wickline could not physically commit the murder himself. He was locked away, separated from the outside world. Yet, his determination to kill her was so absolute that he devised a plan to reach out from the prison and have her executed. It was a testament to his belief in his own power and his ability to control others. He wasn't just plotting a murder. He was orchestrating an assassination, coldly calculating the logistics of having his own wife killed while he sat safe in his cell. The execution of this plan involved a complex web of communication and manipulation. Wickline utilized the prison visitation system and the complicity of unwitting outsiders to convey his orders to John Foster on the outside. He provided detailed instructions on how to track Peggy Sue, when to strike, and how to make it look like something other than a contract killing. The level of detail in his planning was meticulous. He didn't just want her dead. He wanted the murder to appear as a botched robbery, a random act of violence that would lead investigators away from him. On August 18, 1982, while William Wickline was incarcerated in Ohio, Peggy Sue Wickline was brutally murdered in her home in West Virginia, across the state line. She was stabbed multiple times, a visceral and violent act that spoke to the rage Wickline harbored toward her. The scene was staged to look like a burglary gone wrong, with valuables disturbed to create the illusion of a robbery motive. However, the sheer brutality of the attack suggested a personal element that a simple thief might not display. John Foster carried out the assault with a ferocity that was fueled by Wickline's indoctrination. He had been convinced that killing Peggy Sue was the right thing to do, a task necessary for their loyalty to each other. It was a tragedy born of manipulation, a woman losing her life because a man behind bars viewed her existence as an inconvenience. The investigation into Peggy Sue's death initially struggled to find leads. The stage robbery scene initially diverted the police towards standard suspects, burglars, addicts, random drifters. But there were inconsistencies in the scene that bothered the detectives. The violence seemed excessive for a simple property crime, and some items that a typical burglar would take were left behind. As the investigation widened, the focus eventually shifted to Peggy Sue's husband, William. Although he was in prison, the motive of domestic silencing was too strong to ignore. Detectives began to dig into Wickline's life behind bars, uncovering his association with John Foster. They discovered visitation logs that showed frequent contact between the two men. They interviewed other inmates who hinted at Wickline's manipulative nature and his influence over Foster. The breakthrough came when John Foster was arrested for other crimes and, facing the pressure of the investigation and perhaps the crumbling of Wickline's psychological hold over him, began to talk. Foster confessed to the murder, but crucially, he identified William Dean Wickline as the architect. He revealed the specific instructions Wickline had given him, providing the prosecution with the missing link they needed, the motive and the method, all originating from the prisoner. This revelation turned the case into one of the most notorious instances of murder for hire orchestrated from within a prison. The legal proceedings that followed were complex, navigating the uncharted territory of a man who ordered a murder while already incarcerated. In 1989, William Dean Wickline was brought to trial, not for the physical act of killing, but for conspiracy and the manipulation that resulted in death. The prosecution painted a vivid picture of Wickline as the puppet master, a man who was just as guilty of the murder as the person who held a knife because he had willed it into existence. They presented evidence of his controlling nature, his threats against Peggy Sue, and the detailed instructions he provided to Foster. The defense argued that Wickline was being unfairly targeted, suggesting that John Foster was a loose cannon acting on his own volition. However, the weight of the evidence was overwhelming. The psychological hold Wickline had over Foster was undeniable, and the specificity of the crime matched Wickline's expressed desires. The jury saw through manipulation, recognizing that the true power in the deadly relationship lay with the man in the prison cell. Wickline was found guilty of conspiracy to commit murder and was sentenced to an additional term of life in prison, to be served consecutively with his existing drug sentence. It was a victory for justice, acknowledging that physical separation does not negate the guilt of orchestrating violence. The legacy of William Dean Wickline is a disturbing one that extends beyond the death of Peggy Sue. His case became a touchstone in legal discussions regarding depraved heart, standard, and the extent of liability for manipulators who do not commit the actual killing. It serves as a grim warning about the potential for violence to transcend prison walls and the difficulty of rehabilitating psychopaths who view other humans as tools. Wickline spent the rest of his life in the prison system, a man defined by his inability to let go of control. He remained a figure of interest to criminologists and psychologists who studied his ability to influence others. For the family of Peggy Sue, the verdict provided a semblance of closure, but the pain of losing her in such a calculated manner was permanent. The case forced the prison systems to reevaluate how they monitor inmate communications, recognizing that a dangerous mind does not become less dangerous just because the body is locked up. Wickline's manipulation of John Foster destroyed two lives, Peggy Sue's and Foster's, and revealed the terrifying capacity of a sociopath to turn love into a death sentence from miles away. In the end, William Dean Wickline died in prison in 2020, having spent nearly 4 decades behind bars. He never admitted guilt or expressed remorse for his role in the murder of his wife, maintaining his stoic facade until the very end. His story remains a dark chapter in the history of West Virginia and Ohio criminal justice, a case study in the lethality of pure narcissism and control. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that evil is not always a masked figure in the dark, but sometimes a charismatic voice whispering poison into a willing ear. The tragedy of Peggy Sue Wickline is a reminder that the bonds of marriage, meant to be sacred, can become the tether that pulls a victim into the path of a predator. And the chilling efficiency with which William Wickline arranged her death from his cell serves as a permanent warning about the depth of human depravity when coupled with a ruthless intellect. The system eventually caught up to him, but not before he demonstrated that for a true mastermind, prison bars are merely an inconvenience, not an obstacle, to the commission of murder. Number 4, Jody Lee Hunt. A terrifying descent into madness and violence that transformed a local business owner into a mass murderer, shattering the peace of a West Virginia university town in a spree fueled by jealousy, drugs, and an obsession with total control. The story of Jody Lee Hunt is a harrowing narrative of a man who seemingly had everything to live for, yet allowed a dark and consuming obsession to drive him to commit one of the most heinous acts of violence in West Virginia's recent history. To understand the horror that unfolded in the fall of 2015 in Morgantown, West Virginia, one must first peel back the layers of Hunt's public persona versus his private reality. On the surface, Hunt was a successful entrepreneur. He owned a local towing company, Hunt's Towing, and was known by many in the community as a hard-working, if somewhat intense, businessman. He presented himself as a good old boy, someone who was always ready to help a stranded motorist or support a local cause. He had employees who looked up to him and a family that relied on him. However, this facade masked a turbulent and violent interior. Hunt struggled with severe drug addiction, primarily to opiates, a plague that has ravaged many communities in the Appalachian region. This dependency destabilized his mental health, exacerbating his latent tendencies toward aggression and paranoia. But the primary fuel for the fire that was to come was a toxic, abusive relationship with a woman named Amber Martin. Theirs was a connection defined by cycles of intense passion and horrific violence, a dynamic that Hunt sought to control with an iron fist. And when that control began to slip, his world spiraled into a murderous rage. Amber Martin was the center of Jody Hunt's universe, and in his eyes, she was his possession. For years, their relationship played out behind closed doors as a nightmare of domestic abuse. Friends and family of Amber were well aware of the danger she faced, as Hunt exerted an overwhelming psychological and physical grip on her life. He would track her movements, isolate her from her support system, and fly into violent rages over perceived slights or disobedience. Despite the danger, or perhaps because of the intense manipulation, Amber struggled to break free permanently. The volatility reached a breaking point in the months leading up to the murders. Amber finally found the courage to leave Jody, a decision that marked the beginning of the end for her and the unfortunate souls who would be caught in the crossfire. To a controlling abuser like Hunt, the departure of a partner is not just rejection. It is a declaration of war. He viewed her attempts to move on as a personal betrayal that required the ultimate punishment. As Amber tried to rebuild her life, Hunt's behavior became increasingly erratic. He stalked her, threatened her, and made it clear that he would rather see her dead than with another man. This dangerous escalation was a ticking time bomb in the heart of Morgantown, a college town usually associated with the vibrancy of West Virginia University, unaware of the predator in their midst. The catalyst of the violence was Amber's relationship with friend and business associate Hunt's, 39-year-old Jared France. France was a father, a hard-working man, and someone who had apparently tried to help the couple in the past, but eventually became the target of Hunt's psychotic jealousy. In Jody Hunt's warped mind, Jared France was a thief who had stolen his property, the symbol of his loss of control. On November 2nd, 2015, the illusion of normalcy that Jody Hunt maintained shattered completely. The killing began at the towing business that bore his name, a place that should have been a site of commerce and labor, not execution. Hunt confronted Jared France at the business, and in a fit of cold-blooded rage, shot him dead. He killed his friend and former employee in the very place where they had worked side by side, a brutal testament to how quickly Hunt could turn on anyone he perceived as an obstacle. But the murder of Jared France was only the beginning. It was the opening salvo in a campaign of terror driven by a singular, monstrous purpose: to locate and punish Amber Martin. Immediately after killing France, Hunt embarked on a desperate and violent search for Amber. He knew she was likely seeking help or refuge, and he was determined to intercept her. His path of death next led to a home in Westover, a neighboring community, where he encountered 28-year-old Michael David, another acquaintance. It is believed that Hunt viewed David as someone who might be harboring Amber or assisting her in escaping him. In his drug-fueled frenzy, Hunt murdered Michael David as well, cutting down another innocent life simply for being in the way of his revenge. The body count was rising, and the panic in Morgantown was beginning to spread. Law enforcement agencies across the region were scrambling to respond to reports of multiple shootings linked to a single suspect. But Hunt was not done. His bloodlust was not sated by the deaths of the men he blamed for his situation. He was locked onto Amber with the laser focus of a predator. He eventually tracked her down to a location on Camelot Drive, a quiet residential area where she had gone seeking safety from the storm she had escaped. When Jody Hunt finally caught up with Amber Martin, the confrontation was as inevitable as it was tragic. Despite the terror he instilled in her, Amber refused to be his victim in those final moments, showing a bravery in the face of death that her killer could never comprehend. Hunt murdered Amber Martin in cold blood, ending her life and the life of her unborn child. The brutality of this final act was the zenith of his rampage, a horrifying conclusion to a long history of domestic abuse. He had sought to control her in life, and failing that, he ensured she would never escape him in death. He took from her not just her future, but the potential of a new life growing inside her. After the murders, Hunt fled the scene, leaving behind a trail of carnage that would traumatize the community for years. The police closed in on him quickly, establishing perimeter and initiating a massive manhunt. For a brief period, the question was whether he would go down in a blaze of glory or surrender. However, the weight of his actions and the inevitable fall from his pedestal of control seemed to crush him. Before the authorities could apprehend him, Jody Lee Hunt took his own life. He died in a field in Westover, turning the gun on himself and denying the justice system the opportunity to formally adjudicate his crimes. The aftermath of the Jody Lee Hunt shooting spree left Morgantown in a state of shock and grief. For lives were lost in a matter of hours, snuffed out by a man who had once been a neighbor, a boss, and a friend. The community struggled to reconcile the Jody Hunt. They thought they knew what the monster who had massacred 4 people. Vigils were held for Amber Martin, Jared France, and Michael David, with mourners sharing stories of the victims and lamenting the senseless violence. For Amber's family, the pain was compounded by the knowledge of the torture she had endured in her relationship with Hunt. They had watched helplessly as the system and the circumstances trapped her in a cycle of abuse, and now she was gone beyond any help. The case also sparked a renewed conversation in West Virginia about the dangers of domestic violence and the lethal risks involved in leaving an abusive partner. It highlighted the desperate need for better protective measures for victims and the difficulty of predicting when possessiveness will escalate into mass murder. In the years since the tragedy, the name Jody Lee Hunt has become a dark legend in the region. It serves as a grim reminder of the lethal intersection of drug abuse and domestic violence. Hunt's story illustrates how addiction can strip away the moral barriers that keep violent impulses in check, and how an obsession with control can a man's mind into a weapon of mass destruction. There is no trial record to analyze, no sentencing statement to dissect, because Hunt chose a coward's way out. However, the evidence gathered by investigators painted a clear, undeniable picture of a calculated rampage. The forensic evidence, the witness accounts, and a history of 911 calls from Amber Martin all pointed to a man who had progressively dehumanized the people around him. He did not see them as individuals with rights and feelings. He saw them as chess pieces to be moved or removed according to his will. The legacy of this case is etched into the landscape of Monongalia County. It is a story told by true crime enthusiasts not just for its shock value, but for the tragic lessons it imparts. It reminds us that the most dangerous threats are often those we know intimately, hiding behind masks of normalcy until the pressure becomes too great, and the mask cracks. The loss of Jared France and Michael David, innocent men caught in the crossfire of a domestic dispute, underscores the reality that domestic violence does not just stay within the home. It spills out into the streets, endangering friends, family, and first responders. And the loss of Amber Martin and her unborn child is a heartbreaking testament to the urgency of protecting those who are vulnerable to the rage of a partner who refuses to let go. Jody Lee Hunt died by his own hand, But he left behind a legacy of pain that will never fully heal, a scar on the community that serves as a permanent warning about the deadly cost of jealousy and the terrifying potential for evil that resides in the human heart. Number 5, Luke Baber. A case of senseless brutality in the streets of Huntington that served as a grim reminder of the devastating consequences of drug-fueled desperation and the random nature of violent crime. The story of Luke Baber is a harrowing chapter in the ongoing struggle against the opioid crisis that has ravaged West Virginia, painting a picture of how addiction can erode the human soul and transform a young man into a murderer. Huntington, West Virginia, a city once bustling with industrial activity, has found itself at the epicenter of the nation's drug epidemic, a battleground where the fight for survival often leads to tragic outcomes. It was in this environment, amidst the decay and the despair of the opioid crisis, that the events leading to the murder of Megan Spear unfolded. To understand the crime, one must understand the context of the lives involved. Megan Spear was a 28-year-old woman, described by those who knew her as vibrant, caring, and a beloved member of her community. She was a daughter, a friend, and a person who, like many, had her struggles but was working to carve out a life for herself. On the other side of the equation was Luke Baber, a man whose existence had become consumed by the need for drugs. His life prior to that fateful day in 2015 was a trajectory of bad choices and escalating criminal behavior, driven by an insatiable addiction that dictated his every move. The collision of these two lives was not born of a deep-seated feud or a long-standing rivalry, but rather from the chaotic, volatile intersection of opportunity and desperation. The timeline of the crime traces back to the evening of June 6, 2015, in the 600 block of 6th Avenue in Huntington. It was a warm summer night, but the atmosphere was heavy with the undercurrents of the city's drug trade. Luke Baber was on a mission, not for a job or a social visit, but to acquire the substances his body craved. He had arranged to meet individuals with whom he hoped to conduct a transaction, a common occurrence in the shadow economy of addiction. Megan Spear, unfortunately, found herself in the vicinity of this transaction. The details that emerged during the investigation suggested that Megan was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, a tragic victim of proximity to a man operating with a compromised moral compass and a desperate need for his next fix. Initial reports of a disturbance drew the attention of local law enforcement and residents, but the swift brutality of the act meant that help arrived too late to save Megan. The crime scene itself was a tableau of violence that shocked even seasoned homicide detectives. Megan Spear had been shot, a visceral and definitive act of violence that left her dying on the pavement. The setting, a residential street in Huntington, underscored the reality that for communities battling addiction, safety is never guaranteed, even near one's own home. Immediately following the shooting, Luke Baber fled the scene, a reaction that spoke to his consciousness of guilt and panic. In the chaotic moments after the trigger was pulled, he abandoned the victim and attempted to disappear into the labyrinth of the city. The Huntington Police Department launched an immediate investigation, cordoning off the area and scrambling for witnesses. In a community like Huntington, where violence is unfortunately all too common, the silence of witnesses can be a significant hurdle. However, the nature of this crime, the brazen shooting of a woman in a public area, outraged the community. Detectives worked tirelessly, piecing together the movements of Luke Baber prior to the shooting. They utilized surveillance footage from nearby businesses, which captured Baber's erratic behavior before and after the incident. They interviewed associates who knew of his drug habits and his desperate financial state. The picture that emerged was not of a calculating mastermind, but of a chaotic individual driven by the immediate pressures of his addiction. The investigation moved with urgency fueled by the desire to bring justice for Megan Spear, a woman whose life had been cut short in such a horrific manner. As the net tightened around him, Luke Baber was apprehended by law enforcement a short distance from the scene. His capture was a result of coordinated police work and the rapid dissemination of information regarding his description and whereabouts. When confronted with the evidence, the facade of innocence crumbled. The forensic evidence, primarily the ballistic match from the firearm recovered and the eyewitness accounts, made his position untenable. Perhaps the most damning element was his own behavior after the arrest, as he tried to navigate the legal system without a clear strategy other than evasion. In the interrogation room, detectives face a man who was likely coming down from the high of drugs and adrenaline, his reality shifting rapidly. The questioning revealed a motive that was as hollow as it was tragic. The murder was committed during the course of a robbery. Luke Baber had killed Megan Spear not out of personal malice, but because she stood between him and the money or drugs he needed to fuel his addiction. It was a crime of convenience, a decision made in the span of a heartbeat that would destroy two families forever. The realization that a human life was worth less than the contents of a purse or a handful of pills was a bitter pill for the community to swallow. The legal proceedings against Luke Baber were a necessary step toward closure, though they could never repair the damage done. In 2016, facing the overwhelming weight of the evidence and the likelihood of a guilty verdict on first-degree murder charges, Luke Baber opted to enter a plea agreement. He pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, a decision that acknowledged his culpability while avoiding the death penalty or a life sentence without the possibility of parole. The plea deal was a strategic move by the defense, one that spared the family the ordeal of a trial, but also sparked some controversy regarding the severity of the punishment. During the sentencing hearing, the courtroom was filled with the emotional weight of the loss. Megan Spear's family members stood to deliver victim impact statements, their voices breaking with grief as they described the void left by her absence. They spoke of the daughter and sister they had lost, a person who deserved better than to die on a dirty street in Huntington. Judge Paul Farrell, presiding over the case, listened intently, weighing the nature of the crime against Baber's lack of prior violent felonies, though his criminal record was extensive regarding drug offenses. In the end, Judge Farrell sentenced Luke Baber to 40 years in prison, a term that reflected the seriousness of the crime, while adhering to the parameters of the plea agreement. The sentence was a form of justice, ensuring that Baber would spend the prime of his life behind bars, isolated from the society he had violated so grievously. For Megan Spear's family, the sentence offered a measure of finality, ensuring that the man responsible for their pain would not walk free for decades. However, as is often the case in such tragedies, the verdict brought little comfort in the face of such a profound loss. The case of Luke Baber highlighted the cruel arithmetic of drug addiction, where the cost is measured in human lives. It forced Huntington to look in the mirror and confront the reality that its streets had become killing fields, where the desperate prey on the innocent with terrifying randomness. The murder of Megan Spear was not an isolated incident, but a symptom of a larger systemic failure, a point driven home by the senselessness of the motive. Today, Luke Baber remains incarcerated, paying his debt to society within the state correctional system. His name is remembered in Huntington as a warning, a symbol of the potential for violence that lurks within the crisis of addiction for the community. The story of Megan Spear serves as a painful reminder of the value of every life and the need for compassion and intervention before desperation turns into deadly action. The tragedy is that Megan Spear was not an addict, nor was she a dealer. She was a person caught in the crossfire of a war she had no part in. The loss resonates because it could have been anyone. A daughter, a mother, a friend walking down the street. As the years pass, the shock of the crime fades from the headlines, but the scar remains on the heart of the city. The case of Luke Baber stands as a testament to the need for continued efforts to treat addiction and support law enforcement, preventing future acts of senseless violence born from the dark depths of dependency. The story is not just about a killer and a victim, but about a community trying to heal and reclaim its streets from the shadow of drugs. Number 6, Samantha Burns, a heartbreaking story of a vibrant young college student whose disappearance exposed a deadly duo traveling across state lines, leaving behind a trail of terror and a mystery that would take years to unravel. The case of Samantha Burns is one that strikes a particularly deep chord in the heart of West Virginia, a narrative of promise stolen by predation that highlights the vulnerabilities of young adulthood and the existence of pure evil. Samantha, known to her friends as Sam, was a 19-year-old student with the world at her feet. She was studying at Marshall University, a bright and ambitious young woman described by all who knew her as kind, intelligent, and full of life. She lived in Huntington, West Virginia, a college town that pulses with the energy of youth. On November 11, 2002, Samantha was attending classes and going about the routine of a typical college student. However, as the day turned into evening, routine transformed into a nightmare. Samantha was last seen leaving a class, climbing into her car, and driving away. She was planning a future, thinking about assignments, perhaps looking forward to the weekend. No one could predict that she had inadvertently crossed paths with two drifters who would irrevocably alter the course of her fate. The disappearance of Samantha Burns sent shockwaves to the Marshall campus and the surrounding community, a jarring realization that safety is an illusion in the face of calculated malice. The individuals responsible for Samantha's disappearance were Brandon Basham and Chadwick Fulks, two men who had recently escaped from a jail in South Carolina. They were not merely runaways. They were violent felons who embarked on a multi-state crime spree shortly after their escape. Their journey took them northward into West Virginia, bringing them into contact with Samantha purely by chance, but with lethal intent. On that fateful November day, Samantha's car broke down on Interstate 64, a misfortune that left her stranded and vulnerable. In a tragic twist of timing, Basham and Fulks came upon her. What started as a seemingly good Samaritan situation, two men stopping to help a stranded woman, quickly devolved into a kidnapping. The pair overpowered Samantha, forcing her into her own vehicle and then later into theirs. They kidnapped her at gunpoint, an act of random violence that escalated rapidly. The investigation into her disappearance began almost immediately when she failed to meet friends and family. Her frantic parents reported her missing, and police traced her movements to the area where her car was found abandoned. The discovery of her car, locked and abandoned near the interstate, was the first chilling signal that this was not a simple case of a student running off. As law enforcement in West Virginia mobilized to find Samantha, Basham and Fulks were already moving, dragging her across state lines back into the South Carolina area. They were essentially holding a hostage, treating a human being as a pawn in their desperate flight from the law. The details of what happened to Samantha Burns during her captivity are almost too painful to recount, but they are essential to understanding the brutality of her killers. Over the course of several days, she was subjected to unimaginable terror. She was driven hundreds of miles away from her home, her family, and her life. The investigators in West Virginia worked tirelessly, following leads and reviewing surveillance footage, hoping for a sign that she was still alive. However, the trail led them out of the state, complicating the jurisdiction and the flow of information. It was a race against time, with the suspect becoming more violent and desperate as the manhunt for them intensified. Tragically, time ran out for Samantha Burns. While the exact moment and location of her death remained a point of investigation for years, it became clear that she was murdered by her captors. They disposed of her body in a remote area, trying to conceal their heinous crime. She was not a target. She was just an opportunity to them, a convenient victim in their spree of carjackings and robberies. The break in the case came with the capture of Brandon Basham and Chadwick Fulks. They were eventually apprehended in Kentucky, ending their reign of terror. The focus of the investigation then shifted to interrogating these men about the whereabouts of Samantha Burns. This phase of the case was a grueling exercise in frustration for the detectives and the Burns family. Basham and Fulks played a cruel game, offering conflicting information, leading authorities on wild goose chases, and taunting the family with the possibility of revealing the location of her body. Their behavior demonstrated a profound lack of humanity. They held the ultimate power over the grieving family, the knowledge of where their daughter lay. The legal proceedings against them became a battleground for justice. They were eventually tried in federal court on carjacking and kidnapping charges that resulted in death, as Samantha's murder was a key component of the crime spree. In 2004 and 2005, both men were convicted. Chadwick Fulks was sentenced to death, and Brandon Basham was also sentenced to death, a verdict that reflected the severity of their crimes. However, the closure was incomplete. Without a body to bury, the Burns family was left in a state of agonizing limbo. For years, the location of Samantha Burns' remains remained a mystery. Her parents, Don and Kathy Burns, became tireless advocates, never giving up hope of bringing their daughter home. They kept her memory alive in the media, refusing to let the world forget the girl with the bright smile who was taken too soon. The silence from her killers was deafening, a final act of cruelty that extended their torture to the family even from behind bars. It wasn't until 2014, over a decade after her disappearance, that the break finally came. Brandon Basham, perhaps seeking reduction in his own sentence or simply facing the crushing weight of his conscience and the isolation of death row, decided to cooperate. He provided information that led authorities to a site in North Carolina, in the woods of Horry County. Search teams finally found the remains of Samantha Burns. The discovery was bittersweet. It brought an end to the uncertainty, but also reopened the wounds of that terrible day. The confirmation of her death allowed the family to finally lay her to rest, giving her the dignity that her killers had tried to steal. The conclusion of the physical search for Samantha marked the end of a long, dark chapter for the Burns family and the West Virginia community. The case serves as a stark warning about the dangers posed by transient, violent offenders and the random nature of crime. Samantha Burns was simply a student with car trouble, a fact that makes her story even more terrifying. It underscores fragility of life and the predatory instincts of individuals like Basham and Fulks, who view others as objects to be used and discarded. The legal outcomes, with Fulks and Basham on death row, though sentences have since been challenged, and commuted to life due to legal technicalities in the federal system, provided a measure of justice, but the loss is permanent. Samantha's legacy lives on through the scholarship funds established in her name and the tireless work of her parents to support other families of missing persons. The town of Huntington remembers her not just as a victim, but as a vibrant soul who was taken far too soon. The resolution of her case after 12 years is a testament to the persistence of law enforcement and the enduring love of a family that refused to give up. Today, the story of Samantha Burns is taught in criminal justice classes and discussed by true crime analysts as an example of the complexities of interstate serial crime and the emotional toll of missing persons cases. It is a story that haunts everyone who followed it, a reminder that behind every headline is a human life filled with potential. The recovery of her body brought peace, but also illuminated the horror of her final days. Samantha Burns deserved a long life, a career, love, and family. Instead, she became a statistic, a victim of two men who surrendered their humanity to violence. Her memory serves as a beacon for the importance of vigilance and the relentless pursuit of truth. As her family finally found the closure they fought so hard for, the community breathed a collective sigh of sorrow and relief, knowing that one of their own had finally come home. The tragedy of her disappearance will never fade, but the love for Samantha endures, a powerful force against the darkness that took her. Number 7, Gene Whitefeather and Donald Lance, a harrowing case of modern-day bondage and abuse that surfaced in the quiet hills of Sissonville, exposing the dark underbelly of a family unit that operated as a cult of control and cruelty. The case of Gene Whitefeather and Donald Lance is a recent and disturbing addition to the annals of West Virginia crime, shaking the community to its core in late 2023 and early 2024. Unlike the historical or drug-related crimes that often plague the region, this case revolved around the systemic torture and enslavement of vulnerable individuals within a domestic setting. To understand the gravity of the situation, one must look at the dynamic between the two accused and their victims. Gene Whitefeather and Donald Lance presented themselves to the outside world as a couple living a reclusive, off-grid lifestyle. They moved to Sissonville, a rural area outside of Charleston, West Virginia, seemingly seeking isolation. However, that isolation served a sinister purpose. It created a fortress where they could exert total control over their victims without the prying eyes of neighbors or authorities. The victims were not random strangers, but people who had been drawn into their orbit through manipulation and coercion, treated not as family members or guests, but as property. This was a case of domestic slavery, a hidden horror that thrived in the shadows of property that functioned more like a compound than a home. The investigation into Whitefeather and Lance began when law enforcement and child welfare agencies received a tip regarding suspicious activity at the residence. What deputies from the Kanawha County Sheriff's Office discovered when they arrived at the property was a scene of utter deprivation and horror. They found individuals living in squalid conditions, malnourished and physically abused. The details that emerged painted a picture of a life defined by fear, hunger, and pain. The victims, whose identities are protected due to the nature of the abuse, were subjected to unimaginable psychological torment and physical violence. They were often restrained, prevented from leaving the property, and forced to live in filth. Whitefeather and Lance had established a rigid hierarchy where they ruled with iron fists, using intimidation and starvation to break the will of those under their control. It was a deliberate campaign of dehumanization designed to render the victims compliant and helpless. The discovery of these victims was a race against time, as medical evaluations later revealed that their physical condition was deteriorating rapidly, with severe malnutrition and untreated injuries posing immediate threats to their lives. Perhaps the most heart-wrenching aspect of the case was the involvement of children. Among the victims were minors who had been subjected to this living hell. The abuse of children strikes a particular chord of outrage in any community, and the details of the treatment of these kids were stomach-churning. They were denied basic necessities, food, clean water, and medical care, and were allegedly used as forced labor within the household. The psychological abuse inflicted upon them was profound, designed to instill a sense of worthlessness and dependence on their captors. Whitefeather and Lance created a narrative around themselves, possibly involving religious or cult-like delusions, to justify their behavior. They saw themselves not as criminals, but as masters entitled to own and discipline others. This delusion was critical to their ability to commit such atrocities without apparent remorse. For the children, the isolation meant they had no concept of the outside world or the possibility of rescue. Their reality was limited to commands of their tormentors. The rescue of these children was a victory for law enforcement, but the scars, both visible and invisible, will likely last a lifetime. The legal proceedings against Jean Whitefeather and Donald Lance revealed the depth of their depravity and the complexity of bringing them to justice. Following their arrest in late 2023, they were held on high bail, deemed a danger to the community and a flight risk given their transient lifestyle. As the investigation deepened, forensic teams combed through the Sissonville property, gathering evidence of the long-term abuse. They found restraints, makeshift cells, and journals or writings that hinted at the twisted ideologies driving the couple. Prosecutors built a case based on the severe physical evidence and the testimonies of the victims, who had to find the courage to speak out against their abusers. The charges filed against them were extensive, ranging from gross child neglect creating substantial risk of death or serious bodily injury to various counts of abuse and assault. The court proceedings were tense, as the community watched to see if the justice system could adequately punish a crime that seemed to transcend standard definitions of abuse. The prosecution argued that this was not a momentary lapse in judgment, but a sustained, calculated pattern of behavior that required the harshest penalties available. For the Sissonville community and the broader West Virginia population, this case was a wake-up call about the hidden nature of modern slavery and domestic cults. It forced people to grapple with the reality that such atrocities can happen in their own backyard, hidden behind a veil of rural privacy. Neighbors expressed shock and horror, noting that while the couple kept to themselves, they had no idea of the dungeon-like conditions existing within the home. This revelation sparked a debate about the balance between privacy rights and the need for community vigilance to protect the vulnerable. The courage of the social workers and deputies who intervened was widely praised, as they were the ones who ultimately dismantled the House of Horrors. The case also highlighted the challenges faced by the foster care and social services systems in identifying and intervening in cases of severe, organized abuse before it reaches a lethal tipping point. It underscored the need for resources to support the survivors, who would require years of therapy and rehabilitation to recover from their trauma. As the legal process continues to unfold, the story of Jean Whitefeather and Donald Lance serves as a grim reminder of the capacity for human cruelty when combined with fanatical beliefs and unchecked power. Their defense attorneys have hinted at mental health issues or alternative explanations for the victims' conditions, but the physical evidence paints a damning portrait. The community waits for the final gavel to fall, hoping for a sentence that reflects the severity of the suffering inflicted on the victims. In the meantime, the survivors are in safe houses, receiving the care and love that were denied to them for so long. They face a long road to recovery, learning to trust again, and rebuilding the lives that were stolen from them. The case has left a permanent scar on Sissonville, a reminder that evil often wears a mask of normalcy until it is stripped away by the light of investigation. The legacy of this case will hopefully be a more aware and vigilant community, one that looks out for the signs of abuse and refuses to turn a blind eye to the suffering of its most vulnerable members. The tragedy of Whitefeather and Lance is not just in what they did, but in how easily they were able to do it for so long. It is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit that the victims survived at all. Their survival is a victory against the darkness, a reclaiming of life from those who sought to extinguish it. As the justice system moves forward, the eyes of West Virginia, remain fixed on the courthouse, demanding accountability and justice for the voiceless. This case is a stark, uncomfortable chapter in the state's history, but it is one that must be told and remembered to ensure that such a nightmare is never repeated.